comes down as acid rain. How does that process work? And along the way, the ELA, among its many achievements, was the definitive research that led to things like international phosphate bans. This is what the first great ELA experiment looked like, by the way. Basically, David Schindler and his research team inundated one half of the lake with the kind of industrial phosphate levels that we were seeing in the Great Lakes and beyond, and left the other side pristine and destroyed any industry argument of the day that it wasn't them doing the damage. It was clear, as you can see in the color of the lake itself, the algae blooms, the eutrophication that were starving these lakes was coming from industry, and that led to Canada and then other nations banning and reducing the use of industrial phosphate. So that is, again, to come back to this government's primary goal of making Canada the most attractive country in the world for resource investment and development. From a certain angle, the ELA was very little help in that job. In fact, it kept constantly finding problems with large-scale resource extraction and other industrial development. And you looked at some of the experiments that were going on there, and Mike touched upon these. There were researchers at the ELA looking into the full impact of leaking tailings ponds from the oil sands, and on and on and on. So in that meeting, a closed-door meeting that we don't really know how it went down, where it was decided over the course of the fall of 2011 what would be cut. Why would the $2 million we were spending on the ELA jump out as something that needed to go? Was it simply that we couldn't afford it, or was it that the ELA did the kind of work that this government would rather not have to reconcile itself with? Same sort of thing, I would argue, for the High Arctic Research Lab, Pearl. Pearl was closed down when the Canadian Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Science was eliminated, and then the funding was restored, presumably coincidentally the same week that Stephen Harper was in New York making the case that Canada had a great environmental stewardship program. Just coincidentally, that was the week that they restored the funding of Pearl. But Pearl's a great example. If you as a government say that your goal is to reassert Canada's Arctic sovereignty, even to begin exploiting the resources of the Arctic, why would you not value the only window you have in the high Arctic, the only scientific picture you have of what's actually happening on the ground? Well, maybe because it would probably demonstrate that it's an incredibly difficult and dangerous place to do things like oil exploration. But in any case, Pearl left and then came back, and away we went. The important thing, one of the important things I think I learned on this, just as a side note, is that I didn't get the sense of some grand ideological, there's a lot of talk about, is there some sort of secret agenda behind this conservative government? Do they have some secret grand ideological plan? The guy who actually put it best, in my opinion, was a researcher who had to remain anonymous at the National Research Council, who was living under, as Katie mentioned, the regime of Gary Goodyear and his deputies, who stated in 2012 when they were restructuring the National Research Council, will hopefully be a one-stop, 1-800, I have a solution for your business problem organization. A fundamental misread of how technological innovation happens, let alone what kind of work the NRC does. But more than that, it really was, when I interviewed this source, it felt like he was just kind of, it was like someone had come and kind of picked up the NRC and shaken it for no good reason to see what would happen. Just total sort of chaos. And the way he put it was, and he was not working in one of these departments that was very close to climate science or anything that may be considered controversial. What he said was, what I'm seeing is more like a small town hardware merchant, not willing to invest in anything if it's not going to pay off in the next 6 months. So I think that's important to remember in this war. It's not some great ideological opponent that we're looking at. It's a very, very small-minded approach to what government should be and what kind of country we are, that says really all we're interested in is making a buck or two in the next year or so. Everything else is sort of incidental. More than that, we know that if we make good bucks in the next year or so, we should be able to convince Canadians that we should be able to keep our hand on the tiller for another election cycle. That's the one kind of science, by the way, that this government loves, which is the science of voter identification and voter data manipulation and robocalling, and that's fantastic science and very well funded by this government. They're very, very good at it, to their credit. In any case, this will probably not be a surprise to a lot of you in this room, but among other things, this has damaged Canada's international reputation in some circles worse than anything I can think of in my lifetime. I grew up in a country where you could sort of proudly say, whatever its faults, we were a part of the solution to the world's defining problems. But with the silencing of scientists and the derailing of climate change talks and the rest, we now look like a country fundamentally out of step. Some of you in this room might work in sort of international scientific circles, and you've had to address your colleagues who say, what is happening in Canada that you guys have gone so far off the path? What's happening, to my mind, is that this agenda is built on a wager about our short-term goals and our collective memory. And you see that in what this government is willing to pay for. What do they pay for handsomely? More than $130 million since 2009 to plant the phrase economic action plan in the head of every Canadian. $28 million to celebrate the grand military spectacle of the War of 1812. They're clearly willing to spend a lot of money on certain kinds of things and not others. And I would argue that this is the kind of front end of this wager. The wager being, if we create a general sense of prosperity, we target the people we know are with us, we marginalize the ones we know are against us, and everyone in the middle keeps hearing these same messages of prosperity and growth and jobs over and over and over again. And aren't we a proud country? Aren't you proud to be Canadian? And we increasingly associate the conservative brand with the country itself in everything from the background color on websites to all manner of media communications. You won't notice what we are actually doing in your name. And that really is the unacceptable line that was crossed that led me to run for public office and then write this book, which is that they are not allowed to do it in my name. I will not accept a government that is this far out of step, particularly on the defining issue of our time, climate change. We know as Canadians, the vast majority of us believe that we need to be back in the lead. And to do that, we need to get this government gone as soon as we possibly can. So, I'm happy to spend the rest of the evening talking about how we get it gone. I will tell you this much. Whatever you're doing already, keep doing it and keep pushing further, whether it's joining Katie and her colleagues in Evidence for Democracy to make sure that this issue stays on the public agenda. It wouldn't have gotten onto the public agenda without certain people like Katie standing up and saying this is enough. So it is actually important. You all are residents, most of you anyway, of ridings with opposition MPs. Not only that, you're in a city that does protest really, really well. So really, if there's any city that should be leading the charge, I would put Montreal at the top of that rank. So I'd strongly urge you might not think so, I can tell you having been on the other side of the political fence, it really does matter if all of a sudden constituency offices are being flooded with calls on a particular issue. Politicians, particularly opposition politicians, will listen to that. We do need to keep this front and center. We need, amid all the other stuff that's going to happen in what has already turned into a permanent election campaign for 2015, we need to keep reminding Canadians, whatever else you think this government has done, it has undone a century of environmental stewardship and science in the public interest, and that is unacceptable. So thank you all for coming, and let's carry on with the evening.
Yeah.
So I was just going to explain what we're doing while we were doing that, or do you want me to just wait until... Okay, so we're just taking a minute break here while we rearrange the microphones. So I'm just going to fill you in a little bit on what we're going to be doing next. So we're going to be having a brief panel discussion and addressing a couple of questions to our three panelists here. And then after that, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. Et aussi des questions et commentaires sur Twitter. Les discussions, c'est tellement actif sur les hashtags. So on the hashtags, Unmuzzled and Canada's War on Science, there's a whole bunch of tweets, there's a whole bunch of conversation that's going on there. So if people are at home watching the live stream, you can send us questions. We're going to be checking our phone. Put your questions on Unmuzzled, the hashtag Unmuzzled, hashtag Canada's War on Science. And we're going to pose them to the panel here as well.
I'll just hold on to it. It's so sad. It's so demoralizing.
Okay, so the first question, la première question. Qu'est-ce que c'est la situation au Canada en comparaison aux d'autres pays? What's the situation in Canada compared to other countries? I mean, you mentioned obviously it's clear that it's worse here, but are there other countries that are also facing a war on science? Is this a larger, more global problem? How does the situation in Canada compare to other countries?
Right, so I'll begin. I think certainly among the Western democracies, our traditional allies, we are, particularly on environmental issues, particularly on climate change, way out of step. That said, the phrase war on science actually was first kind of came into common usage around George W. Bush's government in the United States. I think the nature of that ideological war was very, very different. If you look at where it came from, it was much more religiously based in the U.S. It involved a lot more sort of opposition to basic science that disproved theology, for one thing. And came from a sort of a general distrust of scientists as academic elites and the rest of it. There's a little bit of a common cause there. Certainly, though, in George Bush's government, you did see Environmental Protection Agency reports being rewritten after they'd been signed off on by their authors in order to particularly reduce the EPA's, or kind of weaken the EPA's stance on climate change. So there were similar sorts of things going on. But certainly you look, just to give an example, I mean, if you want to talk to a government scientist in the United States, and I, as a journalist of a sort, have done so. Last time I was in Florida, I went down and talked to a bunch of ocean researchers about ocean acidification, incredibly sensitive, important climate topic. And it was, one email and a follow-up phone call, and I had 3 interviews with scientists, no media minders, no, questions submitted in advance, unlimited sort of access as I saw fit. And I can't imagine trying to get 3 Canadian scientists on the phone who all, or let alone in person, who all worked on ocean acidification or anything that sensitive. So we do seem to be on this particular stuff, in any case, far, far out of step. I mean, maybe, I don't know, have you seen evidence beyond Canada?
Yeah, well, the U.S. is a good example. I think a couple of months ago, when I was still at Post Media, we had a live chat where we invited Gavin Schmidt from NASA to participate in our panel. And he talked a bit about the situation under Bush, how it changed when the Obama administration took over, that they were fighting against restrictions, having a communications person present, having a comms person present during the interview. That was something that they felt is an intimidation tactic that they did away with. And now someone like Gavin Schmidt, I mean, we can call him up, we can call his cell and just ask him questions. This is a climate scientist from NASA.
Well, to be fair, all through the Bush administration, he had a blog. So, whatever.
I didn't know that, but he was expressing some concerns over some of the restrictions they were facing. I think his boss, James Hansen, I think he fought harder to get, and then there was more efforts perhaps to control him. I guess because of his stature and his reputation, and they feared him. But that was one step towards muzzling. I that would be my example.
Yeah, well, and I always use the James Hansen example as well. I mean, he's the former head of NASA, and he's quite notorious for going and getting arrested at climate protests, and which is interesting on its own, but I once saw an article where they interviewed someone at NASA saying, what do you think about this? What do you think about him, taking a day off from work to go and get arrested? And their response was literally just, what he does on his day off is up to him, which I think kind of summarizes that different mentality of the two countries. But I think it's also important to note that huge policy shift that we saw from George Bush to under Obama, that didn't happen because of nothing. There's actually a group in the U.S. called the Union for Concerned Scientists, and they actually did a lot of really great advocacy work all during the Bush years that really led to those changes. So for me, looking at the U.S. context, it provides a lot of hope, at least, that if you sort of keep the pressure on, that you can hopefully get some better policies when we get a new government.
haven't really thought this location thing through. So the next question, I think there are a lot of scientists in the audience. I think there are a lot of scientists that are probably wondering how to make the connection between the information that they have and getting it out into the media. So the next question is, how can researchers build civic engagement skills? So, comment les chercheurs peuvent développer des compétences d'engagement civique? How can researchers better participate in civil society and the discourse around these issues?
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing is just being willing to do it, you know, not seeing it as something that is, you know, I see it as part of the job of being a scientist. I once saw a really great talk by Stuart Pym, who some of you probably know. He's a great ecologist. And he was really making the case that, you know, the job of professors is to, you know, communicate and educate. And nowhere does it say that they're only supposed to communicate and educate undergraduate students. So he interprets that as it is their job to communicate and educate to the public more broadly. So he sees, you know, doing media interviews, writing letters to the editor as part of his duty as an academic and as a professor. And that's really the view that I take. So, you know, I don't really think there's any special skills. I think every scientist can do it. They just need to want to do it. And then, you know, once you do decide to do it, it's just trying to keep the messages as simple and clear as possible. And I always think of, you know, the example of going to Tim Hortons, and if I can't get my message across to the person in front of me while we're in line waiting for a coffee, it's too complicated. You need to like keep bringing it down until a level where you can, you know, get the point across to someone really quickly. And of course, you know, go to our website and join our network of experts, because that's exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to facilitate.
I would just say, you know, like there is, as much as people knock media relations, sometimes they can help a scientist with, you know, the capacity to communicate, get the message out in a simple way. So, you know, if the government communications, regardless of whatever government it is, if the comms people are doing their jobs properly, they're going to guide the scientists through that process if they're working in government. And yeah, I mean, journalists, we need scientists to speak, to tell the stories of what is happening in science. We can't do that without the scientists. So, you know, I would always encourage, if you're doing some work that you feel is important, the only way the public is going to know about it is if you talk to a journalist. Maybe sometimes journalists might be intimidating. Sometimes they might be jerks. Most of the time, I think journalists do their jobs just like everyone else here does their jobs. You know, we might make mistakes at times, but we can, you know, we'll be friendly, we'll work with you, and you know, if you communicate to us what's important to you, our job is to communicate that to the public, and that's what we try to do.
Right. And I would add to that, I mean, particularly like if you are a scientist, and maybe this won't be news to some of you, do not you know, overestimate how little is understood about what you're doing. I mean, and I don't mean that as a knock on you know, the sort of general public. It's, you know, it's been sort of part of my beat, I guess, as a journalist for the last more than 10 years, to keep up on what's happening in climate change, and I still routinely encounter stuff that I don't understand at all. That, you know, I have to actually go running to things like Gavin Schmidt's blog, Real Climate, to find out when someone just mentioned this thing I've never heard mentioned before. What is it? And try and figure it out. And that you need to do that, or if you're wondering why you need to do that, I guess is the question, is because in the absence of credible scientific voices, as we've seen particularly on the climate change issue, the opponents of clarity on the subject will cloud the water. And so the science is already in the political sphere. It is already under question at a fundamental level of, you know, how does science happen, and I see this all the time, and my sort of shorthand version of it is to say that, you know, an enormous amount of the general public believes that Al Gore is the world's leading climate scientist. That is, they will tell, and intelligent people who have, you know, should know better will talk about him like he is the official spokesperson for the entire field, and so you need those credible scientific voices to say, hey, this is not you know, the common sense versus Al Gore debate. This is a much bigger thing. So I do strongly encourage you, journalists need to hear from me, Canadians need to hear from me.
Okay, moving on. The next question is, what do you think stops people in safe positions? So in other words, retired government scientists, professors that have tenure, from speaking up? Why don't we hear more dissent from people in those types of positions?
Well, I've been trying really hard to get retired government scientists to speak, and there's a few reasons why they haven't. In a few cases, you know, they got severance packages when they left, and they felt that if they spoke out, they might have their severance packages taken away. What's really interesting is I've heard a few examples where, I mean, for the people who are scientists, you'll understand that, you know, your research is your life, you know, so if you lose your job as a government scientist, you're going to try to continue on that research as an academic scientist. And so what I've heard in a few cases is that they were told that if they spoke out, they would lose access to all of the data that they had collected while they were with the government. So which, you know, may not sound like a big deal, but if you've been working, you know, 20 years on a research topic and building your database, like that's your baby, it's your life's work. And so, at least in one case, they were threatened that if they spoke out at all, they would lose access to all of that. And so that is at least a few of the reasons why I think it's hard to get government scientists to speak out.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add to that is, I mean, even John Stone, who's, you know, left Environment Canada, who I spoke to because he'd clearly been talking to the media, and I knew he could, he was very reluctant simply because he didn't think that he should be the stand-in voice for all of Canadian government science. He was uncomfortable with the role a little bit. I think he felt like, you know, I'm not even in there anymore, so how can I tell you exactly how it is? But fortunately was willing to say, you know, speak to what he could speak to, and was a great source. But I think there tends to be, you know, scientists generally tend to be reluctant to, you know, to sort of step out of the lab and make, you know, kind of unequivocal statements in general, and then particularly, you know, if it's something that they think is going to, you know, have blowback in terms of, you know, either their career or their reputation or that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a very personal decision, and if I had the secret to getting people to talk, I would have a lot more.
Great. So I think now we're going to open it up to the floor pour des questions des gens qui étaient ici. We're still taking questions on Twitter, so if people want to send their questions in that way, they can. I see a question right there. Speak up. So just before I let you go ahead, there's one very important thing. This is not commentary time. It's not story time. It's very short, very concise. If it goes on longer than like 30 seconds, I'm going to cut you off. So no preambles, no follow-ups, no multi-parts, none of that stuff. Quick, concise, to the point. We want to give as much time to our panelists as possible to speak. I saw you, no, just below you. Yeah, it's you.
My question was just, we've been talking a lot about government scientists and restricted access to them. Has there been any kind of similar thing with academic scientists, or is it really just focused on the government scientists?
So the question, I'm just going to repeat the questions for the live stream. So the question is that we've been talking a lot about government scientists and restricted access to government scientists. Has there been similar restrictions on access to academic scientists?
Yeah, I could take that. Yes, there has. Some of the scientists that I've been working with or interviewing, at times they've been saying they've had fears about losing government grants, about if they do research with the government, that some of that access might be restricted or they would lose that access. Sometimes they get pressure from senior management at their universities about you know, speaking out too much and doing something that'll cut off their institution. So yeah, it does extend to the academic world as well, at least from what I've seen.
That said, it certainly seemed that when I was researching my book, the academic researchers were much more likely to want to. So
Certainly.
Yeah.
they are freer to anyway.
Yeah, it's more of it's less of sort of a blanket muzzling in academia. It's more, you know, their dean might particular deans might frown upon it, which I've heard that as well. People who have spoken out, then they hear that their dean wasn't very happy about it. People are concerned about appointments at NSERC being particularly more political and possibly, facing blowback there. But a totally separate issue, what I've been hearing a lot is that where you see restrictions on communication in academic research, it's often more due to industry partnerships for the research. So industry, pays a whole whack of money for science at a university and then makes the academic scientists and the grad students often sign confidentiality agreements.
And actually, just a final addendum on that. And most of you might be aware of this, but part of the sort of bureaucratic cover for some of the muzzling and some of the other stuff that this government has done is that you do have, as a member of the civil service, you do have you have taken an oath to work in a certain way. Now, it's being, to my mind, abused by this government, but that is the sort of cover for it. And I think for a lot of those scientists within government, that's the one big difference. I mean, you as an academic researcher don't have that sense of, my job is to make the institution's policies happen, whereas that is your job ultimately as a civil servant. And so that's sort of like a big fundamental difference between academic and government researchers, although there are other mechanisms.
Right here.
Yeah, we moved into an epoch. We now have 45 out of the top 50 companies in the world are financial companies. I think the link has been broken between profit-making, capitalist profit-making, and science. And this is fundamentally allowing the war on science to occur. I mean, I'm interested in your opinion on that, but I think it goes beyond just Canada and beyond just the conservatives.
Right. Well, I mean, there's no question that your point well taken. And actually, I'll repeat it for the live stream. So the question, does this go beyond Canada's war on science? Is this in part because financial service companies are actually the main center of power, basically, in the world today? I mean, I think that's true to a point, in that certainly if you look at not only the just sometimes direct and sometimes just sort of inspirational connections between some of these communications controls and the rest of it, it comes from large scale industrial efforts over the years to hide inconvenient evidence and silence critics by attacking their reputation. The rest of it, that connection there, and there's no question that this is a government, to my mind, that sees its job primarily to enable the continued growth of that. Of those companies and of the companies that they have controlling interests in that actually do the work on the ground and the rest of it. So there's no doubt that we have a government that sees the interests of those companies as more, in some cases more important than the interests of Canadians, to my mind, even though they do it under this sort of patriotic smokescreen. So the point's taken. That said, I do think we do still in our sovereignty have the ability to do things like bring in regulations on everything from tailings ponds to greenhouse gases that those companies will work inside the realm. I know this personally, being from Calgary. I mean, the companies that are headquartered, some of them in Calgary, that are developing the oil sands, work in jurisdictions like Norway, for example, where there are much tighter controls on things like greenhouse gases, and they get along fine. So they will conform. If you've got a government with some spine, they will conform to it. But we don't have a government that I think even sees that as spine. I think they see it as weakness. So.
And if you guys don't have anything else. So we're going to take a question from Twitter, from Jeff Graham, who's a well-known climate activist around these parts. He wants to know, what steps do we take to make the scientific community motivated to express their research to the public once the CPC is out, once the Conservatives are out of power? I guess his point is, how do we undo the damage in terms of the scientific community that's used to being afraid to express itself? How do we undo? Getting the Conservatives out of power is the first step. What's the next step to get people back in the habit?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I mean, part of the problem with dealing with scientists is they tend to be quite conservative, not politically, but in they're not looking for a microphone to talk about their research. They're not looking for media, and often they'll really self-censor themselves. And I think that's what's really been the most damaging about the current policies. and Mike touched on this a little bit as well, is that there really is just this sort of culture of fear. So you have people, if the line is drawn here, they're still sort of 10 feet back from it, really afraid to sort of go anywhere near the line. And that's going to be really hard to overcome. And I think, we need to look more to what they did in the US, where they actually put in place like very clear and explicit communication policies that, say scientists are allowed to talk to the media. They even, do have sort of a personal view exemption policy in there for most government agencies, saying that they are even allowed to comment on policy. They just have to make it clear that they're giving their own opinion on policy. It's not the official government statement. So, you're really going to have to make it clear and explicit that we want them to talk to the media and encourage them to do so.
Great, you guys are good. Over up there.
I was wondering what you feel is the reversibility of what's already been done to our system. It's a lot easier to slash things than to build up institutions. It takes a lot more political will. And so if a different political party came into power, what could we reverse quite quickly, and where are the places where we've lost a lot of capacity in the long run?
So for the live stream, the question is, what's the reversibility of what's been done? What are areas where things can be reversed quite quickly if another party gets into power, and what are things where more significant long-term damage has been done that'll be more difficult to reverse?
Right. Well, I mean, certainly some of the legislative stuff is as easy to reverse as it was to change in C-38. So you want to restore the original protection language of the Fisheries Act, you just bring a bill, that's a pretty straightforward act of parliament right there. And certainly, all the opposition parties have said that they want to restore both funding and some of the...
Have they said explicitly that they...
I don't know about the Fisheries Act. They've said explicitly about the funding and the...
Because I have some doubts about whether, in opposition, you can criticize all you want, but I haven't heard them explicitly say we're going to reverse this legislation.
Fair enough, true.
And I don't know about the funding either. And the funding issue is tricky in terms of if there's a deficit or not a deficit. There will be pressures from all parties, I think. Maybe not the Green Party, but